When did the Galactic Civil War actually start? Some historians say that the conflict started in 0 BBY with the Battle of Scarif. It was one of the first times the Alliance to restore the Republic was able to unite their various factions and face the Empire in a conventional slug-out. But then again, some scholars point to the Battle of Atollon in 2 BBY as the starting point of the war. This was also a conventional battle, and it took place 2 years prior to the Battle of Scarif. Other historians will claim that no, the beginning of the conflict actually started in 4 BBY with a series of attacks on the local Imperial garrison on the world of Lothal, a sign of things to come. And of course, there are others who will say that the war started even earlier than that, with some claiming that the resistance against the Empire began the day it rose from the ashes of the Galactic Republic. To really get to the bottom of the question of when the Galactic Civil War started, we actually have to look past the New Republic, the Rebel Alliance, even the Alliance to restore the Republic. We have to go all the way back to the first factions that rebelled against the Empire all by themselves. A warrior culture loses its identity in times of peace, but a culture constantly at war loses its identity. When the Clone Wars started, the Mandalorians had just emerged from a very brutal civil war that had been fought between the new Mandalorian faction, which was focused on economic reform and social progress, and Death Watch, which was a more traditionalist faction. The new Mandalorians ended up winning that conflict, and during the Clone Wars, they decided to become neutral. They actually had the Council of Neutral Systems, which was made up of over 1,500 different star systems. This political stance unfortunately put Mandalore and its leader Satine Kryze within the crosshairs of the Sith. The Sith had planned the Clone Wars in order to sow chaos in the galaxy, which would push the electorate into giving more power to the executive branch of the government so that Chancellor Palpatine could bypass the Senate and quickly militarize the galaxy. Satine Kryze was a very charismatic and effective leader, and her calls for pacifism and neutrality in the Clone Wars was essentially a large roadblock for the Sith's grand plan. And so the Sith, via their agent Count Dooku, leader of the Separatist movement, would funnel money into the new Mandalorians' rivals, the Death Watch. This would lead to a second civil war and the eventual fall of the new Mandalorian political movement and the death of Satine Kryze. This was only possible, though, because Death Watch had allied with the fallen Sith Lord Maul, who had orchestrated an alliance with several crime factions, which would provide the bulk of the manpower for the Death Watch's hostile takeover of the planet. While the new Mandalorians were now gone, the sister of Satine Kryze, Bo-Katan Kryze, a Death Watch member herself, would actually break away from the organization. This occurs after Maul challenges the existing Death Watch leader Pre Vizsla to a duel and basically wins the title of Mandalore, or leader of the Mandalorians. Bo-Katan's splinter faction refuses to acknowledge Maul, and they would become known as the Night Owls. They would carry out a low-intensity resistance against Maul's Death Watch until finally, in the last moments of the Clone Wars, the Republic, which up until this point avoided getting involved with the Mandalorian Civil War, finally sent the 332nd Division of the 501st Legion to support the Night Owls in retaking their planet. This mission was a success, but literally the moment Death Watch was defeated and Bo-Katan took stewardship of the planet, Order 66 would happen and the Republic would fall. Bo-Katan, the newly made regent of Mandalore, would refuse to cooperate with the Empire. Her own loyal Mandalorians were outnumbered by the Imperial clone army, and soon she was driven into exile once again. Clan Saxon would collaborate with the Empire, and Gar Saxon would be appointed viceroy and governor of the planet. In exile, the Night Owls would once again resist the Empire. It wasn't until 2 decades later that the Night Owls would finally retake their world and remove the Saxons from power. This was all because the Darksaber would return to Mandalore, and it would unite several anti-Imperial Mandalorian clans beneath the Night Owls. Unfortunately, it was at this point that the Empire realized that the Mandalorians were impossible to control, and so they decided to raze the entire planet in a tragic event known as the Great Purge. There's one recurring factor that is prevalent amongst all of the early factions that rebelled against the Empire, and that is instability. Instability makes living harder and dying easier, and when life becomes cheap, then people become more willing to do extreme things to force change, to rebel. Life on Ryloth was not easy. The entire planet was covered in violent storms and also very, very dangerous animals. Just trying to stay alive was a daily struggle. The most precious resource on the planet, aside from some real spice deposits, were the people itself. And for generations, the local Twi'leks would be preyed upon by their more prosperous and rich neighbors, the Hutts, the Zagarian slave empire, and other criminal organizations. Therefore, the #1 occupation on Ryloth for the Twi'leks was slavery, followed by hard labor, followed by working for a criminal organization, followed by being a rebel. During the Clone Wars, Count Dooku sent Wat Tambor to essentially strip Ryloth of what few riches it had. Given the planet's close proximity to Hutt space and very far distance away from the center core worlds of the Galactic Republic, this seemed like a pretty good idea at the time. The Republic garrison on the planet was quickly overwhelmed and eventually wiped out, protecting Twi'lek refugees. These surviving Twi'leks would turn into the Twi'lek Resistance, led by Cham Syndulla. They would be unable to do much aside from hide in the wastelands and occasionally strike out against the Separatists. The Battle of Ryloth would eventually end with the Republic/Twi'lek Resistance forces capturing the capital of Lesu in 21 BBY. This would be one of the Republic's early victories in the war. A clone garrison would be left on the planet to secure it from any future Separatist attacks. For 2 years, there would be peace on the planet. The clone troopers were legitimately seen as heroes for driving away the Separatist droid army. But then, in 19 BBY, with the end of the Clone Wars, Ryloth became a protectorate of the Galactic Empire, which meant that the Twi'leks would be politically autonomous, but their territory would be controlled by the Empire. Soon it became very apparent that the Empire's intentions for Ryloth was very similar to the other criminal organizations that controlled the planet before it. Basically, the Empire began looting the planet's resources and enslaving the local people. Some clones, like Captain Hauser, would hesitate to enforce these new policies, having developed real connections and respect with the locals, but ultimately he would be in the minority and arrested. Although hopefully we do get to see him in the second season of Bad Batch. Anyway, Cham Syndulla would reform the Twi'lek Resistance into the Free Ryloth movement, just months after the formation of the Galactic Empire. The old revolutionary would once again reactivate their hidden army and begin stockpiling resources across the planet. 5 years later, in 14 BBY, the Free Ryloth movement would carry out one of the most audacious assassination attempts of Emperor Palpatine and Darth Vader. On a routine inspection of the system, Cham Syndulla was able to knock out Emperor Palpatine's Star Destroyer, which forced the two Sith Lords to go planet-side, where they would be hunted for several days by the Resistance movement. Unfortunately, they failed to kill both Sith Lords. The Jedi guarded the weak and downtrodden for thousands of years. In their moment of need, is it surprising that they found allies all across the galaxy willing to help them? The Hidden Path was started as a result of the Empire's brutal pursuit of Force users, not just Jedi, but any regular Force user. When the Inquisitorius came for Quallen Roken's wife, their actions helped create a new rebel faction. Roken would begin to set up an underground railroad that smuggled Force-sensitive and fugitive Jedi from the core regions of the galaxy out to the Outer Rim, where the Imperial presence was more limited. We're not exactly sure when the Hidden Path was officially started by Roken, but he found no shortage of willing volunteers all across the galaxy. The organization even had Imperial officers amongst their ranks. A world rich with resources, but poor in their ability or motivation to exploit those resources, will find themselves exploited instead. They say that Kashyyyk was terraformed by the legendary Rakatan Infinite Empire for agricultural purposes. This is why the planet has exceptionally fertile soil and some of the largest species of flora the galaxy has ever seen, including the massive Worshire tree, which would grow miles into the sky. The wood itself was so light and rigid that it was actually used for starship construction. And no, we're not just talking about the paneling we see on woody wagons. I'm talking about the actual mechanical structure and fuselage of starships. Very impressive. The planet also had massive oil deposits lying right below the surface. This is what would bring the Separatist alliance to the planet during the Clone Wars. The Wookiees would be aided by the Republic and Grandmaster Yoda himself during the Battle of Kashyyyk, and together they would push the Separatist droid army off the planet. But moments before their victory was secured, Order 66 was executed, and the Galactic Republic would turn into the Empire. The Wookiees sided with the Jedi by aiding Master Yoda's escape. This most likely drew the ire of Emperor Palpatine, but we're not sure if this is what started the brutal occupation of Kashyyyk that would follow afterwards. The Empire would blockade the planet and begin besieging the main Wookiee tree cities. Kashyyyk would fall, and the Wookiees would be enslaved and forced to cut down their own trees and farm food to feed the growing Imperial military. Chieftain Tarful, one of the most decorated Wookiee generals from the Clone Wars era, would continue fighting against the Empire after the Separatist droid army was defeated. He and his Wookiee resistance fighters would use their knowledge of the planet's dangerous Shadowlands to keep themselves hidden from Imperial patrols. The rush of battle is not all that different from the rush one gets from spice, neurologically speaking, of course. Both can be habit-forming and make us forget ourselves. The world of Onderon had aligned itself with the Separatist Alliance willingly during the opening days of the crisis, after King Sanjay Rash took over the throne. A brother and sister, Saw and Stila Guerrera, would start a resistance movement that supported the former monarch King Ramses Dendup. This movement would oppose the planet's alliance with the Confederacy. The Republic would covertly send a team of Jedi and clones on a foreign internal defense mission and begin training the small group of resistance fighters in the art of guerrilla warfare. Stila Guerrera was the brain and heart of the operation. She was charismatic and saw the larger picture of what the movement needed and where it needed to go. Saw, on the other hand, was just a highly sharpened weapon, aggressive and focused on smaller tactical victories. The Onderonian resistance would prevail in overthrowing Separatist rule on the planet, but Stila would lose her life in the final battle of the war. With the rise of the New Order, the same story that I'm sure you guys are familiar by now happened on Onderon. The Galactic Empire would annex the planet, and shortly after, Saw Gerrera would have to reform the Onderonian resistance movement and turn it into the partisans movement. The partisans would become infamous for the amount of collateral damage they left in their wake, but one cannot argue about their effectiveness in killing Imperials. Before we continue on to our last, and in my opinion, most important entry on this list, let's talk about some honorable mentions. First, we have the Mimbanese struggle against the Empire, which was just a continuation of their struggle against the Separatist Alliance during the Clone Wars. We're not exactly sure when the Mimbanese would rebel against the Empire, but as early as 10 BBY, we know that Imperial mud troopers were engaging the Mimbanese in heavy trench warfare. Another honorable mention should go to the planet of Mon Cala and its people, given the very watery nature of their planet. The Republic never maintained a garrison on the world, even after helping settle the planet's own civil war during the Clone Wars. However, a year after the rise of the Empire, a battle would be fought on the planet between Imperial forces and the local Mon Cala military. This was all started due to a false flag operation carried out by the rogue Jedi known as Farron Bar. The Mon Cala would be defeated and King Li Char would be captured by the Empire. Several Mon Cala ships would, however, manage to escape the planet under the leadership of Admiral Raddus, who would later take part in the Battle of Scarif. Next up, we have the fall of Lasan. Not much is known about when this happens or what exactly happened during this period of time, but the Empire genocided the entire planet and wiped out most of their species. Apparently they used disruptor rifles, and this was so disturbing that the Imperial Senate actually banned the Galactic Empire from using these type of weapons. The Lasat and their culture and language were thought to be almost extinct after this event. Luckily, the original homeworld of Lasat was rediscovered in wild space. A large population of Lasat were still living on their original home planet, and they would continue the survival of their species and culture. A revolution without an ideology dies with the first wave of martyrs. Most of the factions that we talked about in this video had very legitimate reasons to resist against the Empire. Many times their worlds were already occupied. However, most of these factions were isolated from one another, and they didn't really stand a chance against the larger galactic-wide empire. This is what made Senator Bail Prester Organa and his resistance movement so unique and important. Organa hailed from the power centers of the galaxy on Alderaan. He was a close ally to Chancellor Palpatine and also a member of the Loyalist Committee during the Clone Wars. He, along with other senators like Padme Amidala and Mon Mothma, saw the direction the galaxy was heading towards in the last year of the war. And so, from day one, Bail Organa resisted the Empire. During Order 66, Bail Organa would help rescue former leader of the Jedi Order Yoda from his failed assassination attempt of Emperor Palpatine. Organa would maintain his position within the Imperial Senate because he was from such a culturally important world. Not even Emperor Palpatine could touch him without a reason. And so Bail Organa would use the resources of his planet and his diplomatic status to begin building a secret resistance movement across the galaxy. He would create stockpiles of weapons, refit civilian ships for combat duty, set up the Fulcrum secret agent network, and perhaps most importantly, kept an eye out for burgeoning resistance movements that could be connected together. Bail Organa was essentially the architect of the alliance that restored the Republic. So there you have it, guys. Those are the various factions that really make up the early rebellion. We don't talk about it a lot because most of us are focused on the Rebel Alliance versus the Galactic Civil War, but by the time the Galactic Civil War had officially started, there were already rebels fighting for almost 2 decades against the Empire. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy.